Hi, class. I'm covering Chapter 11, which is the Operational Liabilities and Insurance chapter. This will be on our last exam, which will be exam 3 for this particular course. I hope before we get into this that you're all doing well, that you're staying safe, and hopefully we'll bring all this course to an end in pretty much the next 3 or 4 weeks. So just stay focused, keep watching the videos and the chapters, and I'll cover the materials that you need to know, and use your textbook as well to help you through these exams. And we should get through the course pretty quickly. So here's basically chapter 11. I'm just going to go through the slides for you. So our first slide is regarding the term negligence. So the book says negligence is conduct that creates an unreasonable risk of causing injury to another person or damage to property. I think that's an important note, that negligence can be not only towards a person, which is probably more common and what most people typically think of as negligence, but it can also be against a person's property. This is very important because, as you know, as future entrepreneurs, you're going to be owning or leasing a property. And so there are some liabilities related to whether you own the property or whether you are leasing that property. So having a negligence as part of property, I think, is something that's important for you to know. As you look on the slide here, it says duty. Duty is a person with a legal duty to another, is required to act reasonably under the circumstances to avoid harming the other person. So again, we get into that legal term that's always a little bit shaky when we talk about what's reasonable and what's not, and oftentimes is why these cases end up in court, because what one person's definition of reasonable may be very different than another's. And so oftentimes we have to have a judge kind of make that decision for us. So when we talk about landowning and tenant, there's a duty of landowner or tenant. We have a legal duty to keep real property, that's real physical property, reasonably safe. And it may be, if not, we are liable for injuries. So that's injuries that can occur to an employee or to a customer. I said in the very, very beginning of the course, if you remember back in January, before all the craziness happened, I told you guys that there are really two groups of people that will take legal action against us. It's either the employees or it's the customers. So, you know, our duty of the employer, that's you, they're liable for any negligence that's committed by employees acting within the scope of their employment. So oftentimes when I go through this lecture, during a normal semester, one of the things that I will talk about when it comes to duty of employer is, let's use an example. You decide that you asked one of your employees to go out to the store to pick up lunch for you or for others, and you've given them the keys to your car, and they've gone out to pick up lunch for you and maybe other people in the office. And that person decides, you know, they have enough time, so they decide to take a break and go to a bar and maybe drink a couple quick martinis before they come back to work. And they are driving back to work and suddenly have a car accident that injures or kills someone. You as the employer actually are liable for that, even though the employee acted out of the confines of your work. They were actually out doing a duty that you've commanded to them to do as the employer. So it can get really sticky under what is considered scope of employment. If an employer asks an employee to do something, you're taking on any of the liability that that employee is doing at the time. Now, if that employee is off for a lunch break and they go out on their own accord during that lunch break without your knowledge, and they drink and have their own car and cause an accident, completely different story. So again, as the employer, you do have some liability in what you ask your employees to do. So be very, very careful when it comes to that. The book continues to talk about two different types of negligence. One is called contributory negligence. And that's if the plaintiff was also negligent in any manner, they cannot recover damages. So if that case that I gave to you in a scenario earlier, if that case would go to court, you may be able to claim contributory negligence in that the person acted on their own accord. And then it would be a question of whether you had knowledge that they had a drinking problem prior. We could get pretty sticky. But if they contributed in any way, the person who was damaged contributed. So let's say the person was driving back, was not intoxicated, and the person was driving back, and a person stepped in front of their car, not in a crosswalk, and they were hit. In that case, the plaintiff contributed to the negligence. They stepped into traffic not using a crosswalk. Your employee was just doing an errand for you and was not drunk. In that case, it would be contributory negligence. Comparative negligence, that allows the plaintiff to recover the proportion of his or her loss attributable to the defendant's negligence. So what they can actually do is they can say, well, based on the circumstances of the case, you are 95% guilty, and the defendant, let's rephrase that. You were 60% liable, and the defendant was 40% liable. That means that they could get under comparative negligence, they could recover 60% of what they were suing. So it actually will break down the negligence actually in a percentage. The book goes on to talk about torts, and we hear tort reform a lot. Tort reform, whenever you hear that, particularly in the political realm, what they're looking at in tort reform is to limit the amount of maybe frivolous lawsuits that happen. And so that's what they mean by tort. But in tort that protect persons, the book talks particularly about the top three, which are battery, false imprisonment, and emotional distress. When it comes to battery, again, that's harmful or offensive contact with plaintiff's body or something touching it. That could be their jacket, their sleeve. If you get angry at an employee and you grab them and somehow you're controlling them, it can be considered battery. It can also be considered false imprisonment. So that's the intentional restraint of movement against someone's will. So you stand at an exit to someone's office and they're not able to get out of their office while you're going to chew them out. That could be considered false imprisonment. You're taking away their ability to leave the office without a physical confrontation with you. So battery, again, can be the contact. Imprisonment can be controlling where they are. You lock them in somewhere. And then the third one is emotional distress. And that protects the right of peace of mind. So if someone feels that they're being, treated very poorly and they're afraid all the time and you're a very threatening person or you have an anger issue, they could come back and sue you for emotional distress. There also are torts that protect there are other ones as well. Defamation, that's communication to a third party of an untrue statement that injures your reputation. So we have to be very careful of that when we're giving references. We have to be very careful of not giving too much information. We can also be sued for invasion of privacy. They have private information, eavesdropping, or unauthorized use of their personal information. There are torts related to property. Trespass to land, that's the unintentional invasion of real property without someone's consent. So they can come onto your property without your consent, would be trespass to land. There are nuisance, that's interference with the use and enjoyment of real property. Maybe someone is playing music very loud, or they have a toxic smell, or they're burning things in the backyard. All kinds of crazy things that can be considered a nuisance. And then we have what's called conversion, which protects the right to have one's personal property left alone. So people do have a right to that. We see those kind of cases sometimes in like hoarding cases where the government will have to step in and say, the property is full of junk and it's a nuisance to the neighborhood. If you ever watch any of these hoarding shows, and I do watch some of them, it's amazing how long a hoarder can continue to hoard stuff on their property without having any kind of legal recourse. And you're like, well, why does it take so long to do that? This is why, because it is their property, and within reason, they are able to utilize their property within legal limits to however they want to. And that can be a bit of a problem. There are some strict liabilities when it comes to property. Ultra hazardous activities and toxic tort. Um, Ultra hazardous activities are self-explanatory. You have a right to not have your neighbor, building bombs in their basement or cooking weird things in their backyard or starting fires in their backyard. This is why we have ordinances to not burn leaves in the fall, because it's actually infringing on your right as the neighbor to not have that. And again, in businesses, same thing. So in your business operations, the dumping of waste and toxic waste, those kinds of things are heavily, heavily regulated. There's a toxic tort, and that's the wrongful act that causes injury by exposure to a harmful, hazardous, or poisonous substance. In that case, again, it could be employees or customers can come to your office or come to your plant, but they have to be protected, and that's an issue. Particularly right now as we deal with COVID-19, that's been an issue that's been coming up now is, what about those Amazon workers or those Walmart workers? What is reasonable exposure for them to continue to work, or grocery store workers, that go into grocery stores and continue to work? I mean, the public needs to have groceries and food, but yet what is the risk and what are the companies doing to provide protection for them? So that could be under toxic tort. There are some remedies to tort. So there's actual damages. That's where they actually will give you money or repair, replace items. There's punitive damages, again, awarded to punish the defendant. So to try to punitively punish the person who's doing the wrongful act, to force them to stop performing those acts. And then there's an equitable relief. The court prohibits the defendant from continuing in a certain course of activity. So they'll give a stop and desist order, say you need to stop that activity as well. Finally, this particular chapter talks about insurance. There's first-party insurance. So we need to insure ourselves against these things. So we have first-party insurance that protects the policyholder in the case of damage or loss to the insured or its property. And you have that. If you have a car, you're paying those kind of insurances already, or even a property. And then there's also a liability insurance, and that's any kind of liability from conduct, and that protects you from slip and fall, car accidents when it comes to your business cars, any product defects that may happen. I shared with you in class, I know it's been quite a while since we were together, but I talked to you about an umbrella insurance policy, which I have, which is an umbrella. It's just an overall liability insurance that protects me against, because you can't foresee, every kind of risk. And so because of that, we provide an umbrella policy that will help protect, against unforeseen liabilities that happen as well. Okay, so that's pretty much it for chapter 11. So again, keep reading in your chapters. The videos and the PowerPoints are not going to cover everything that you'd see on the exam, but it will give you a good overview of the things that we would have covered if we were together. Again, stay well, and I will see you in the next chapter. Take care.